Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 177, IO 534e to 535a. Socrates has just finished his account explaining why Io is interested and good at Homer, but uninterested and not so good at any other poet, to the extent that, as he himself admits, he nods off whenever he hears anyone talking about other poets. Socrates has given three analogies, which we might charitably say explain three different aspects of the poetic art, because they by no means explain one particular aspect. And this is a problem because they are all supposedly explaining why the poet has no techne, has no intelligence when actually performing poetry. And this came about because Io himself said that he is interested only in Homer and not the others, and Socrates suggested that someone with a techne would be interested in all poets and would be good at expounding all poets. Io seemed to have no problem with the claim that Socrates made that Io lacks a techne, and indeed he was interested to hear Socrates' reasoning, which is why we may suppose Socrates goes all out to show that poets lack intelligence when they are good poets. It's actually when they're bad poets that they can have intelligence. It's only when they have a good divine poem that they are considered lacking in intelligence. As I say, if all three analogies are supposed to explain one thing, why the poet lacks intelligence, we have a problem, because the three analogies discuss or explain different aspects. The first analogy, the magnets, explains that the poet doesn't actually have any techne because he is divinely inspired, but the analogy is that the god is the magnet, and the poets, the rhapsodes, and the audiences are attracted to one or other magnet, one or other god or goddess. If the poet, rhapsode, and audience are supposed to be inspired by a poem at the time that they are being inspired, then we have to regard the magnetic force itself as a poem. The poem flows through all of the iron rings in the chain, the poet, the rhapsode, and the audience, and this is what attracts them back to the magnet, the god who devised the poem in the first place. This then, in a way, ties in with the third analogy, where we find that poets lack nous because they are to be regarded as empty vessels through which the god speaks. Even if we allow the god to speak through not only the poet but also the rhapsode, it's a bit difficult to say that the god speaks through the audience. They are not speaking, they are listening to the rhapsode. But if we don't push the analogy, it's fairly similar to the first one in essence. Although the first one is talking about attraction back towards the magnet, while the third one is talking about the dissemination of a poem from the god through the various vessels to the audience. The flow seems to be going the other way. And then we have the second analogy, which doesn't fit the first or the third at all, in my opinion. The claim for the lack of intelligence in a poet in this analogy is that the poet needs to be weightless, so he removes his nous, his intelligence, in order to fly up to the gardens of the Muses, where he finds honey, and this honey must be the poem. If we allow for the poem to be the invention or discovery of the Muses, as Tianechoros states in his paean, then the poems in general, we can go that far, the poems are all inventions or discoveries of the Muses, which are then left around waiting for poets to discover them and bring them back to earth. We should discount the idea that the poets remove their intelligence just in order to fly off up into the gardens of the Muses, but we could say that the poet doesn't require intelligence if the poems are not created by the poet, but by a god or goddess. Even if we were to resolve the three analogies, which we really can't and we really shouldn't, they're quite bad analogies, even if we did, we would still be left with the absurd proposition that poets who write or compose bad poetry have techne. It's the ones who compose divine poetry who lack techne. By extension, any expert craftsman is actually not an expert. He is not Sophos, and he doesn't have a techne at all, because he is merely inspired by a god, while the awful technitai, the bad craftsmen, who are not inspired by any god, are the ones who should be regarded as having a techne, although they're bad at it. This is a ridiculous proposition. Throughout the three analogies, Socrates seems to have proved not only that poets who compose good poetry are out of their minds, they lack intelligence, but also someone who loves rhetoric is also incapable of using his intelligence. At any rate, Io has been perfectly silent during the whole account and hasn't reacted once. It's only now that he will react when Socrates asks him a direct question. U doko soi alethe legen, O Ion? Don't I seem to you to be saying true things, Io? Nai maton dia emoige. Yes, by Zeus, to me indeed, you seem to be telling the truth. Haptegar pos mu tois logois tes psyches, O Socrates, kai moi dokusi thea moira hemin paraton theon tautahoi agathoi poietai hermenuen. For you somehow touch my soul with your words, Socrates, and the good poets seem to me to expound these things from the gods to us with a divine lot or portion. The distinction between good and bad poets has not been lost on Io, but he doesn't seem to understand the ramification with regard to bad poets. How do they compose their poetry? Is it through gods? No. Is it therefore through techne? Yes, unfortunately, they're bad at it, but they must have some techne. While we're at it, we could ask what the gods have. How do they compose poetry? Would we say they don't have a techne? Would we say they are not sophoi at composing poetry? Socrates' attempt to remove techne from what it is that Io does is rather suspect. Notice that Io doesn't say that Socrates has proved anything to him or that he is actually telling the truth. He just says that the words have touched his soul, or rather Socrates has touched his soul with logoi, which may be words or arguments. It doesn't really matter because he's not really thinking things through. We encountered Thea Moira, the divine lot or portion, during the read-through of Meno. According to my calculations, Meno is later than Io, so this foreshadows what is said about Thea Moira in Meno, and we shouldn't really try to compare this with Meno. Plato at the time of writing Io was surely not already thinking of the dialogue Meno. All we can say here is that this might be slight evidence that the notion of divine lot, when it comes to some sort of wisdom, was already in the air, and Socrates didn't have to make it up on the spot, although, of course, the whole point of Thea Moira in Meno is simply to provide a fourth option for Meno, and Meno's really happy about it. For what the good poets do, Io has again used the verb hermeneuo, which I have translated this time as expound, but it could also be interpret. And I still think that poets can't be interpreting if the gods are speaking through them and the poets have no sense, no intelligence to speak of. So for quite a while now we've been talking about poets, and Io is a rhapsode. So it's about time that Socrates returned to rhapsodes, and this is what he does now. Uk humes au hoi rhapsodoi taton poeton hermeneuete, kai tuto alithes leges. Well then, you as well, the rhapsodes, you interpret the things of the poets, or you expound the things of the poets. And this too you say true. Uk hermeneon hermenes gigneste pantapa sige. Well then, you have become the interpreters of interpreters, or expounders of expounders. Absolutely. Well, at least Io is happy with this.